In the summer of 1914, as Europe plunged rapidly into the vortex of total war, the Eastern Front opened under conditions of extreme tension and deep strategic contradiction. The German Empire, despite being one of the world's foremost military powers, faced the greatest fear embedded in its war planning: the threat of being crushed between two fronts, France in the west and Russia in the east. That fear shaped every strategic decision made in Berlin during the opening days of the First World War, and ultimately set the stage for the decisive events in East Prussia, where the Battle of Tannenberg would erupt and carve its place into military history. Under the Schlieffen Plan, Germany concentrated its elite forces in the west with the aim of defeating France swiftly before turning to face Russia. This left the Eastern Front dangerously thin, defended primarily by the Eighth Army, tasked with holding East Prussia. It was a high-risk gamble. If Russia mobilized faster than expected, the entire German strategy might collapse within weeks. For the Russian Empire, the war offered both strategic opportunity and political necessity. Pressured by its French ally, Russia was determined to attack quickly and force Germany to divert troops from the Western Front. Despite severe logistical limitations, poor organization, and a fragile rail system, the Russian High Command resolved to strike early into East Prussia. Their goal was to crush Germany's Eighth Army and seize a region of immense symbolic and strategic value. East Prussia was more than a military zone. It was the ancestral homeland of Prussia, the cradle of German militarism and national pride. The prospect of Russian troops overrunning this land was not merely a military danger, but a psychological and political catastrophe. For Berlin, surrendering East Prussia without a fight was unthinkable. Against this backdrop, Russia advanced with two massive armies. General Pavel Rennenkampf's First Army approached from the east, while General Alexander Samsonov's Second Army moved up from the south. On paper, the Russian plan appeared formidable, a double envelopment designed to trap and annihilate Germany's outnumbered Eighth Army. With overwhelming numerical superiority, Russian commanders believed German resistance would crumble quickly. But beneath the surface of this ambitious strategy lay fatal weaknesses. Coordination between the two Russian armies was fragile from the outset, not only due to distance and communication difficulties, but because of a bitter personal rivalry. Rennenkampf and Samsonov had clashed violently during the Russo-Japanese War, leaving lasting mutual distrust. In an operation that required near-perfect coordination, such a rift was perilous. Meanwhile, the early days of the campaign in East Prussia were marked by anxiety and hesitation within the German command. The Eighth Army, led initially by General Maximilian von Prittwitz, seemed on the brink of being overwhelmed. Early clashes, especially at Gumbinnen, went poorly for the Germans. Prittwitz even contemplated retreating deep into Germany, a proposal that Berlin considered politically and militarily unacceptable. At that critical moment, the German command system underwent a transformation. Prittwitz was dismissed, and leadership of the Eighth Army was handed to General Paul von Hindenburg, with Erich Ludendorff appointed Chief of Staff. Accompanying them was the brilliant strategist Colonel Max Hoffmann, who possessed intimate knowledge of East Prussian terrain and the inherent flaws in Russia's deployment. This change represented more than a personnel shift. It marked a shift in mindset from defensive desperation to the search for a decisive, annihilating blow. The geography of East Prussia played a decisive role in shaping the coming battle. It was a land of forests, lakes, marshes, and limited road networks, terrain that hindered large armies and complicated communications. The Russians were forced to stretch their forces along poor roads and slow supply routes, while the Germans enjoyed a highly efficient internal rail system, allowing them to redeploy forces rapidly across key sectors. This contrast would soon prove decisive. Morale on both sides also differed sharply. Russian soldiers entered East Prussia believing they were undertaking a crucial mission, yet they carried exhaustion, shortages, and uncertainty into unfamiliar terrain. German soldiers, though outnumbered, fought with the conviction that they were defending their homeland and the honor of Prussia. This emotional contrast gave the coming confrontation an especially intense character. By late August 1914, all these factors converged, transforming East Prussia into a powder keg ready to explode. The two Russian armies pressed deeper, convinced victory was within reach. The lone German army, seemingly outmatched, reorganized under new command and quietly prepared a devastating counterstroke. In this atmosphere, the Battle of Tannenberg would unfold, not merely as a military clash, but as a collision of strategy, leadership, geography, and the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. What followed would become one of the most destructive and iconic battles of the First World War. As the East Prussian campaign entered its final days of August 1914, the opposing forces carried into battle immense armies. Yet they were organized, led, and prepared under conditions so drastically different that their eventual clash would expose a fatal imbalance. The Battle of Tannenberg was not merely a confrontation between two armies. It was a collision between two military systems whose levels of organization, command capability, and battlefield adaptability differed so profoundly that the outcome was quietly predetermined. These differences would pave the way for the catastrophic destruction of one of the Russian Empire's largest field armies. On the Russian side, two major armies advanced into East Prussia. The First Army, commanded by General Pavel Karlovich Rennenkampf, pushed in from the east, moving across the Lithuanian frontier. This force included several infantry and cavalry corps, with a combined strength of several 100,000 men. Rennenkampf, a seasoned and disciplined officer, was known for his toughness, yet also for a cautious and sometimes slow decision-making style. Though his troops held a clear numerical superiority over the German defenders, they were operating across unfamiliar terrain, dependent on an overstretched and inflexible supply system. Advancing simultaneously from the south was the Russian Second Army, commanded by General Alexander Vasilyevich Samsonov. The army destined to suffer the most tragic fate of the entire campaign. Samsonov, a devoted officer known for his sense of responsibility, found himself tasked with an operation far beyond the practical capabilities of the forces under his command. The Second Army, enormous in size and composed of multiple infantry corps supported by artillery and cavalry units, was spread thin across a broad front and forced to rely on East Prussia's inadequate dirt road network. In terms of equipment, the Russian armies brought massive numbers of infantry and artillery, but their quality and coordination were inconsistent. Russian artillery suffered from ammunition shortages and sluggish logistical support. Their infantry carried the durable Mosin Nagant rifle, but its rate of fire and potential for coordinated firepower fell short of German standards in a mobile war. Even more problematic was communication. Russian headquarters frequently transmitted orders via unencrypted or poorly encrypted radio, allowing German intelligence to intercept and decipher their operational plans with ease. At the highest levels of command, coordination between the two Russian armies was superficial at best. Rennenkampf and Samsonov not only lacked a unified operational framework, they were personally estranged by long-standing animosity dating back to the Russo-Japanese War. The two commanders barely communicated, and when they did, their messages were delayed or disconnected from battlefield realities. As a result, Russia's two massive armies advanced into East Prussia as separate, uncoordinated entities, leaving dangerous gaps that a skilled adversary could exploit. In stark contrast stood the Germans, who had only a single force in the region, the Eighth Army. Numerically, it was far inferior to the combined Russian armies. But Germany's advantage lay not in numbers, but in organization, leadership, and operational mobility. After the dismissal of General von Prittwitz, command passed to General Paul von Hindenburg, a retired officer recalled for his prestige and experience. Equally important was his chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff, fresh from his success at Liège, along with Colonel Max Hoffmann, the strategic mind most intimately familiar with East Prussia's terrain and Russian operational habits. Hindenburg provided authority and final decision-making. Ludendorff pushed for rapid, decisive action, but Hoffmann was the architect of the campaign plan. It was Hoffmann who identified the fatal weaknesses in the Russian deployment, especially the lack of coordination between their two armies and the exposed, elongated lines of march. German command soon made a daring decision: to ignore Rennenkampf's First Army in the short term and concentrate all available strength on annihilating Samsonov's isolated Second Army. German preparations reflected the modernity of the early 20th century German military system. They fully exploited their dense internal rail network to move entire corps rapidly across East Prussia, an advantage Russia simply could not match. German artillery was well supplied, tightly organized, and capable of coordinated action with infantry forces. The Maxim machine gun was deployed in far greater density, giving German units a decisive firepower edge in both defensive and counteroffensive engagements. Morale, too, diverged sharply. German troops entered the campaign fully aware that they were defending their homeland. East Prussia was not a distant battlefield, but ancestral soil. Every town, forest, and road carried emotional weight. German soldiers fought with the conviction that defeat would mean not merely lost territory, but national humiliation. Russian soldiers, meanwhile, marched deep into enemy territory under harsh conditions, growing increasingly uneasy at the eerie absence of German resistance. An ominous silence they lacked the experience to interpret as a deliberate trap. Thus, the two sides entered the campaign from fundamentally opposing foundations. The Russians relied on sheer numbers, confident that mass alone would crush their enemy. The Germans, though outnumbered, placed their faith in mobility, accurate intelligence, and rapid decision-making. By late August 1914, as the Russian armies pushed deeper into East Prussia unaware that a trap was closing around them, the German command had completed the final preparations for a devastating counterstroke. All these elements, leadership, weapons, logistics, morale, and organizational sophistication, combined to form the stage upon which tragedy would soon unfold. The Battle of Tannenberg would not be the result of chance, but the direct consequence of an asymmetry in preparation so severe that every German strength was magnified by a corresponding Russian failure. What followed would become one of the most catastrophic defeats in the history of the Russian Empire. The opening phase of the Battle of Tannenberg unfolded in the final days of August 1914, as Russia's two field armies continued advancing deep into East Prussia, convinced they were driving Germany's 8th Army into a corner and were on the verge of securing a decisive victory. Yet behind this seemingly favorable advance lay a far more dangerous reality. The Russian forces were drifting apart, stretching their lines across difficult terrain, and without realizing it, exposing fatal vulnerabilities for the Germans to exploit. After the Battle of Gumbinnen, where the Germans failed to win a clear victory over Rennenkampf's First Army, Russian headquarters assumed the enemy was retreating in a weakened state. Rennenkampf pushed forward slowly but steadily from the east, increasing the already wide gap between his army and Samsonov's Second Army to the south. Samsonov, under pressure to accelerate his advance and complete the strategic pincer movement, drove his troops through East Prussia's dense forests, lakes, and marshlands, terrain that made an already strained logistical situation even more desperate. The core of the Russian Second Army moved along narrow, dusty, often muddy roads, stretching its columns for dozens of kilometers. Communication between units became increasingly fragile, while messages from Russian high command arrived late, fragmented, and often inaccurate. Samsonov was forced to make decisions based on scattered reports that did not reflect the true situation. Even so, he continued to assume Rennenkampf would soon close in from the east to support him, an assumption both pivotal and completely mistaken. On the German side, the opening phase of Tannenberg unfolded in calculated silence. Under the direction of Hindenburg, Ludendorff, and especially Max Hoffmann, the 8th Army began an extraordinary redeployment by rail. German corps were withdrawn from the front facing Rennenkampf and rapidly shifted southward, concentrating the army's full strength against Samsonov. It was a bold and risky decision, temporarily leaving the eastern approach exposed, but the German command believed Rennenkampf would be too slow to intervene in time. On 23rd to 24th August, German vanguards made contact with the flanks and rear elements of the Russian Second Army. These initial clashes were scattered but fierce, as German infantry, supported by accurate artillery fire, struck Russian columns still strung out in marching formation. Many Russian units were caught off guard, unable to form proper battle lines in time, and forced to fight defensively under chaotic conditions. Though not decisive, these engagements dispelled any illusion that the Germans were retreating in disarray. One decisive factor in the early phase was Germany's interception of unencrypted Russian radio transmissions. Marching orders, unit positions, and Samsonov's operational plans were revealed almost entirely, giving German headquarters a clear view of every Russian movement. This allowed Hoffmann and Ludendorff to adjust their strategy with precision, positioning German forces to strike at the weakest points in the Russian line. Samsonov, meanwhile, remained unaware that his every step was being monitored. For the ordinary Russian soldier, the early phase of Tannenberg felt less like a pitched battle than an exhausting march. They trudged across unfamiliar territory, short on food, water, and reliable information about the enemy. When fighting erupted, many Russians were stunned to find the Germans appearing in greater strength and firepower than expected. German Maxim machine guns quickly tore through Russian formations accustomed to massed infantry tactics. On the German side, morale rose as the sense of control and confidence in the unfolding plan grew. German soldiers felt they were no longer merely defending, but actively guiding the enemy into a massive trap. Infantry and artillery worked in close coordination, seizing key villages, crossroads, and forest paths, each one tightening the encirclement inch by inch. Every captured road and every occupied ridge further constricted the Russian army's movements. By 25th to 26th August, the intensity of the fighting increased dramatically. German forces expanded their attacks against both flanks of the Russian Second Army, especially to the west and northwest. Russian corps in these sectors faced mounting pressure, battered by precise and continuous German artillery fire that disrupted any attempt to form defensive lines. Many Russian units were pushed back or forced into disorderly retreat, widening gaps in an already overstretched front. Samsonov began to sense the growing danger. But attempts to withdraw or reorganize were hampered at every turn. German forces threatened or cut off the routes behind him, while Rennenkampf's First Army remained far too distant to intervene. Orders issued in haste often failed to reach their intended recipients, or arrived too late to be effective. The early phase of Tannenberg thus took on the contours of a tragedy in motion. Its warning signs increasingly obvious, yet impossible to reverse. By the end of this phase, the Russian Second Army had not yet been fully encircled, but it had fallen into a perilous position. Its lines were overextended, both flanks were under heavy attack, rear areas were disintegrating, and morale was starting to falter. Meanwhile, the Germans had finished concentrating their forces, secured key strategic positions, and were ready to deliver the decisive blow. What unfolded in the early phase of Tannenberg was not a sudden collapse, but a slow tightening of a noose. Each Russian misstep magnified into a looming strategic catastrophe. As the sun set over East Prussia's forests and lakes on the 26th of August, the battlefield settled into an eerie quiet. For the Russian soldiers, it was a moment of exhaustion and vague unease, unaware that they stood on the brink of one of the most devastating encirclements of the First World War. For the Germans, it was the calm before the storm, every piece of the plan now in place, waiting only for the moment to snap shut the trap called Tannenberg. The climax of the Battle of Tannenberg erupted between 27th and 29th August 1914, when the strategic trap painstakingly prepared by the German High Command finally snapped shut around Russia's Second Army. What unfolded during those fateful 4 days was no longer a series of scattered engagements or recoverable tactical errors. It was the total destruction of an entire army inside an iron ring, where every possible route of escape was cut off hour by hour, minute by minute. Once the Germans completed their rapid redeployment by rail, the main corps of the 8th Army pivoted south and southwest, concentrating their full strength against the two flanks of Russia's Second Army. On the western side, 17th Corps, under August von Mackensen, launched fierce assaults to drive Russian units off the key roads they needed for retreat. On the eastern side, other German corps tightened the encirclement, turning Samsonov's already overstretched lines into a chaotic, fragmented mass. German artillery played the decisive role during this phase. Batteries positioned with exact precision on ridges and forest edges poured relentless fire onto Russian concentrations struggling to form defensive positions or force a breakout. Combined with dense belts of Maxim machine guns, this firepower crushed any attempt by Russian troops to counterattack or regroup. Infantry formations accustomed to mass assaults now found themselves defending desperately with little command, poor information, and virtually no supporting fire. In the forests and lake country of East Prussia, the terrain itself became a ruthless enemy. Roads choked with shell craters or seized by German infantry, forest paths blocked or dominated by machine guns. These left Russian units funneled into marshes and wooded traps where movement became nearly impossible. Many formations became lost, cut off from headquarters, and fought in complete confusion, unable to distinguish friend from foe. Chaos spread as corps and divisions were isolated and destroyed piecemeal. For General Alexander Samsonov, the climax of the battle was a succession of desperate, agonizing hours. He realized his army was being encircled, yet every plan for withdrawal crashed into the same brutal reality. The roads behind him were already in German hands or under devastating shell fire. Orders to retreat went out far too late, failed to reach their destinations, or became irrelevant as the battlefield collapsed around them. The immense burden of responsibility pressed down on Samsonov as he watched the vast army entrusted to him being wiped out, with no hope of salvation. On August 28th and 29th, the encirclement became complete. German forces launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions, splitting and destroying Russian groups one after another. Fighting devolved into close-range combat in forests and small villages. Bayonets, rifles, and machine guns deciding the fate of entire units. Many Russian soldiers fought to the last cartridge in desperate attempts to break free, but nearly all were cut down by overwhelming firepower and the disciplined coordination of German forces. For the Russian soldier, the climax of Tannenberg brought fear, exhaustion, and despair in equal measure. They had marched and fought for days with little food, water, or rest. When the reality of encirclement dawned, some still held out hope for a miracle, or for intervention from Rennenkampf's First Army, but that hope evaporated as the sound of German guns closed in from every direction. For many, the final choice was no longer to fight or withdraw, but to surrender simply to survive. For the Germans, the climax of the battle felt like a victory taking shape, though it was far from effortless. Their units fought continuously across harsh terrain against pockets of desperate resistance. But unlike their opponents, they fought with clear intelligence about Russian positions and with unwavering artillery support. Each German advance tightened the ring, crushing the Second Army slowly but inexorably. One of the most tragic moments of the entire battle was the complete disintegration of Russian command. As forward headquarters were overrun or cut off, many units received no orders for hours or even days. Junior officers were forced to make life-or-death decisions with no information and under unbearable pressure. Independent withdrawals only worsened the chaos, allowing German forces to annihilate isolated groups one by one. The tragedy reached its darkest point when General Samsonov, unable to bear the weight of defeat and the loss of tens of thousands of men, took his own life in the forests on the 29th of August, 1914. His death became a grim symbol of the total collapse of the Second Army and of the hopelessness of the situation facing Russian troops. Meanwhile, German forces continued rounding up or destroying the remaining pockets of resistance, turning the climax of Tannenberg into one of the greatest military disasters in the history of Imperial Russia. As gunfire faded across the East Prussian landscape, the climax of Tannenberg ended in a heavy, suffocating silence. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were taken prisoner. Thousands more lay dead across forests and lakes, while the Germans stood firm on their homeland soil. The magnitude of what had occurred was measured not only in casualties and captives, but in the near-total annihilation of an army in less than 4 days. In that moment, Tannenberg became a stark symbol of the brutal logic of modern warfare, where strategy, intelligence, and organization can determine the fate of hundreds of thousands in a span of days. As the sun dipped behind the forests and lakes of East Prussia on the 29th of August, 1914, the Battle of Tannenberg came to its grim conclusion in a landscape of devastation and an eerie, suffocating silence. The thunder of artillery and the desperate charges had faded, leaving only endless columns of prisoners, fields strewn with bodies and shattered equipment, and the complete collapse of Russia's Second Army. In less than 4 days, a massive field army had been wiped from the map, marking one of the most catastrophic military defeats of the First World War. Militarily, the outcome at Tannenberg was a sweeping and annihilating victory for the German Empire. Russia's Second Army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were encircled, destroyed, or forced to surrender under utterly hopeless conditions. The remnants broke apart into scattered groups with no capacity to fight or even retreat in any orderly fashion. This battle was not merely a defeat, it was the near-total eradication of a major army formation in a span remarkably short by the standards of modern warfare. Russian losses at Tannenberg were staggering. Estimates place the dead and wounded between 30,000 and 50,000, with an additional 90,000 to over 100,000 soldiers taken prisoner. Huge quantities of artillery, machine guns, and equipment were lost, inflicting not only crippling manpower losses, but also a severe blow to Russia's operational capabilities in the coming months. For many Russian units, Tannenberg was not a setback from which to learn, but the end of their existence. For Germany, the victory came at far lower cost, though not without sacrifice. German casualties totaled only a few thousand, a small figure given the magnitude of the battle. The disparity illustrates Germany's decisive superiority in command, organization, communications, and combined arms coordination. German artillery and machine guns operated with brutal efficiency against Russian formations trapped and forced into disadvantageous terrain, while rail mobility and logistics enabled the Eighth Army to maintain relentless operational tempo. The death of General Alexander Samsonov became the most tragic symbol of Tannenberg's outcome. His suicide in the forest after realizing his army had been virtually annihilated reflected the crushing weight of honor and responsibility borne by commanders of that era. For Russia, his death was not only a military blow but a profound psychological shock, shaking confidence in the Imperial Army's leadership and organization during the opening weeks of the war. Strategically, the impact of Tannenberg reached far beyond the East Prussian front in the summer of 1914. The victory secured East Prussia and removed an immediate threat to a region of immense symbolic and political value to Germany. More importantly, it prevented the catastrophic scenario of a deep Russian penetration into German territory at a time when most of Germany's best armies were committed in the West. For Russia, the defeat shattered its initial offensive plans and forced a complete reassessment of its strategy on the Eastern Front. Although Russia still possessed vast manpower and would continue fighting for years, Tannenberg exposed systemic weaknesses: poor coordination between armies, inadequate communications, backward logistics, and a command structure in which personal rivalries could cripple operations. These shortcomings would continue to haunt the Russian military throughout the war. For Germany, Tannenberg became an enormous national symbol. The very name Tannenberg was chosen deliberately to evoke the memory of the Teutonic Knights' medieval defeat by Polish-Lithuanian forces in 1410, a symbolic act of historical revenge in the German national psyche. Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff emerged from the battle as national heroes, celebrated across the country, and soon propelled into central roles within Germany's wartime leadership. This triumph cemented their personal prestige and political influence for years to come. From a military theoretical perspective, Tannenberg was a powerful demonstration of the new logic of modern warfare, one driven by information, mobility, and integrated arms. Germany's exploitation of Russia's unencrypted telegrams, combined with rapid troop movements by rail and focused firepower at critical points, showed that numerical superiority alone no longer guaranteed victory. It was a costly lesson for Russia and for all European powers about to engage in a long and brutal war. On a human level, Tannenberg was a collective tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers entered East Prussia with confidence in victory, only to leave as prisoners, casualties, or corpses left behind in the forests and lake country. East Prussia became a vast grave for an entire army, where individual lives were crushed by strategic decisions and high-level failures. For German soldiers, the victory was not unblemished joy. They witnessed the near-total destruction of their enemy and confronted the terrible price modern warfare demanded. Viewed through the lens of history, the 1914 Battle of Tannenberg was not only a brilliant German military triumph, but also an early warning of the unprecedented brutality that would define the First World War. It revealed that in an age of artillery, machine guns, and modern communications, an entire army could be obliterated in days if it made fatal strategic errors. Tannenberg etched its name into history as one of the most destructive battles of the 20th century, a moment when the fate of hundreds of thousands was sealed in just 4 short, harrowing days, leaving consequences that would echo far beyond the Eastern Front and shape the course of European history. The Battle of Tannenberg in 1914 closed as a chilling, blood-soaked chapter of history, where strategy, intelligence, and organization determined the fate of hundreds of thousands of men in just 4 short days. It was not only a devastating triumph for the German army, but also a profound tragedy for Russia, as an entire army was wiped out amid the forests and lakes of East Prussia. Tannenberg left an indelible mark as a stark reminder of the brutality of modern warfare, where a single error in command can unleash a catastrophe beyond redemption. How do you reflect on the Battle of Tannenberg and the tragic fate of Russia's Second Army? What haunts you more? The cold precision of the German strategic trap, or the terrible price paid by Russian soldiers caught within that iron encirclement? If you find this content insightful and rich in historical value, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow us as we continue exploring the fierce battles that shaped the First World War and the history of the modern world.